February 14, 1943. The Tunisian plain south of Sidi Bouzid. Midday. 51 M4 Sherman tanks of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, United States 1st Armored Division, are rolling east across open desert toward a village the Germans seized that morning. Their commander is Lieutenant Colonel Louis Hightower, a man who already knows what is waiting for him on the other side of the dust. Elements of the German 10th and 21st Panzer divisions have set a textbook armored ambush. Anti-tank guns are dug in along the flanks, invisible behind ridgelines of sand and scrub. Panzers, including Tigers from the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, are positioned on both sides of the approach. Hightower knows he is outnumbered. He knows the terrain offers no cover. He drives in anyway because there are American infantry positions on the hills beyond Sidi Bouzid that will be overrun by nightfall if he does not. What happens over the next several hours will become one of the defining catastrophes of the American armored experience in the Second World War. The German guns open from 3 directions at once. Sherman after Sherman takes hits, and when they are hit, they do not merely stop. They do not merely lose a track or throw a sprocket or stall with a damaged engine. They burn. They burn with a violence that has no comparison in the experience of the men watching from behind the ridgelines or through the periscopes of the surviving tanks. A Sherman struck by a 75mm armor-piercing round in the hull side does not smoulder. It does not give off a thin trail of smoke and allow the crew those critical 30 seconds to open their hatches and roll out onto the sand. It erupts. The ammunition inside the fighting compartment detonates in a chain of secondary explosions that blows the turret upward off the hull ring and sends a column of fire 30 feet into the desert air. The 5 men inside the vehicle have, in most cases, less than 10 seconds to escape before the temperature in the fighting compartment becomes unsurvivable. Many of them do not get 10 seconds. Many of them get no time at all. By the time the surviving tanks pull back west toward the American lines, 44 of the original 51 have been destroyed or disabled. The desert behind them is dotted with smoking steel shells that were, an hour earlier, fighting vehicles crewed by living men. Photographs taken in the days after the battle, now archived at the United States Army Center of Military History, show a field of Shermans with their turrets displaced and askew, their hatches blown open from internal pressure, their hulls blackened and in some cases split apart from the inside out. The signature of those wrecks is not the neat round hole where the German armor-piercing round entered the sponson. The signature is the catastrophic structural failure caused by what happened after the round got in. Something inside those tanks was killing the crews far more efficiently and far more violently than the German shells themselves. The wider battle made things worse. Over the days that followed, as the German offensive drove westward from Sidi Bouzid through the passes toward Kasserine, the American Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall would suffer over 2,500 casualties and lose 103 tanks in the opening phase of what became known as the Kasserine campaign. In engagement after engagement, the same pattern repeated. A Sherman would take a single penetrating hit, a hit that in engineering terms should have disabled the tank but left the crew alive with time to evacuate. Instead, the tank would catch fire within seconds of penetration. The fire would be so intense, so instantaneous, that even men who were completely uninjured by the initial impact could not escape. The word spread through every American and British armoured unit in the North African theatre within weeks. The Sherman burns. It burns more easily, more violently, and more lethally than any other Allied tank in service. British crews had already noticed the problem months earlier. 252 M4 Shermans had been operational with the British 8th Army at the start of the Second Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942, distributed among the 1st Armoured Division, the 10th Armoured Division, and the 9th Armoured Brigade. From the very first actions against Rommel's forces, British tank commanders reported that the Sherman had a disturbing tendency to brew up when penetrated. The British began improvising fixes almost immediately, bolting an extra inch of applique armour plate over the hull sponsons, where the ammunition racks sat, and cutting access openings through the turret basket, so the assistant driver could pass rounds up to the loader, reducing the number of vulnerable rounds stored in the exposed side racks. These field modifications helped at the margins, but they did not solve the fundamental problem. British crews began calling the Sherman the Tommy Cooker, a name borrowed from a small portable trench stove used to heat rations during the First World War, because the tank cooked its own crew the same way the stove cooked food. The Germans, who called British soldiers Tommies, reportedly used the same name from their side. American tankers would adopt the nickname Ronson after the cigarette lighter, because it supposedly lights every time. Whether either name was in widespread use during the war itself or became more common in the post-war retelling is a question historians continue to debate. The Ronson slogan that everybody quotes, "lights first time every time," has never been found in any verified period Ronson advertising from the 1940s, but the reality behind the nicknames was beyond question. The Sherman had a fire problem. By the spring of 1943, every man who climbed through a Sherman hatch and pulled it closed behind him knew he was sitting inside a machine that could kill him from the inside as easily as the enemy could kill him from the outside. The problem followed the Sherman across the Mediterranean. In Sicily, in July of 1943, during the invasion at Gela, the Hermann Goering Panzer Division launched a ferocious armored counterattack against the American beachhead. The 1st Infantry Division, supported by field artillery firing directly from the beach and naval gunfire from the cruisers Boise and Savannah, bore the brunt of the fighting, with Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division committed in support as they came ashore. The Americans held. But the crews who survived noticed the same pattern they had heard about from North Africa. When a Sherman was penetrated, it burned. When it burned, the men inside had almost no time to get out. At Salerno in September, the story was the same. At Anzio in January and February of 1944, where the beachhead was compressed into a perimeter so tight that German artillery could reach every part of it, Sherman crews fought with the knowledge that every hit they took might be the one that turned their vehicle into a funeral pyre. The fire problem was not improving. It was becoming the defining anxiety of American armored warfare. Crews began entering combat with their hatches cracked open, accepting the risk of shrapnel and small arms fire in exchange for a faster escape if the ammunition ignited. Some crews stacked sandbags on the hull floor, hoping to absorb spall and keep fragments away from the ammunition racks. None of it was enough. The engineering of the vehicle itself had to change. Here is the thing you need to hold in your mind as this investigation unfolds, because without it, the rest of the story loses its force. Everything those tankers believed about why the Sherman burned was wrong. Every explanation that crewmen accepted, that war correspondents filed in their dispatches, that generals repeated in their memoirs, that Hollywood would eventually turn into a permanent fixture in the public memory of the war, was built on a misdiagnosis so complete that it survived for decades after the truth was available. They believed the Sherman burned because it ran on gasoline. They believed a gasoline engine turned the tank into a rolling fire hazard, and that the Germans, whose tanks they assumed ran on diesel, had avoided this problem entirely. That explanation was clean. It was intuitive. It required no technical knowledge to understand. A man did not need to know anything about armor metallurgy or propellant chemistry to grasp the idea that gasoline catches fire and diesel does not, and it was almost entirely false. The real reason the Sherman burned had nothing to do with its fuel. The real reason was a decision about where to store the main gun ammunition inside the hull, and the process by which that truth was uncovered, tested, proven, and translated into an engineering fix is one of the most consequential and least known stories of the entire war. Because by the last winter of the fighting, the tank that had earned a reputation as the easiest medium tank to burn in Europe had quietly become one of the hardest. Not because anyone designed a replacement, not because a general demanded a new vehicle, because someone looked at the evidence instead of the assumption and asked the right question about the wrong answer everyone had already accepted. This is the story of a mistake in the placement of ammunition racks inside the hull of the most widely produced Allied tank of the Second World War, and of how that mistake, once it was correctly understood, led to the single modification that saved more tank crews than any other change made to any Allied vehicle in the entire conflict. To understand the mistake, you have to understand what the inside of an early production Sherman looked like. The M4 Sherman entered mass production in 1942 as the standard medium tank of the United States Army. It was designed from the beginning to be built fast. America needed thousands of tanks, not dozens. The Sherman was engineered to be assembled by automobile factories and locomotive plants using workers who had been riveting car frames 6 months earlier. It was designed to be shipped across the Atlantic on cargo vessels, unloaded at ports from Liverpool to Oran, driven to the front, and maintained in the field by mechanics whose previous experience was with farm equipment and commercial trucks. In many respects, the design was a triumph of practical military engineering. The engine, whether it was the Continental Radial, the Ford 5.8, the General Motors Diesel Twin, or the Chrysler Multibank, was accessible from the rear deck without removing the turret. The transmission was at the front, which meant the drivetrain could be serviced without tearing the entire vehicle apart. The hull was wide enough to give the crew reasonable working space. The turret ring was large enough to accommodate a range of different guns as the war progressed. Most importantly for the men inside, the Sherman was designed with more escape routes than almost any other tank of its era. The commander, gunner, and loader could exit through hatches in the turret. The driver and assistant driver each had a hatch in the hull roof. By October of 1943, even the loader received a dedicated hatch. And there was a belly escape hatch under the assistant driver's position, accessible when the upper exits were blocked by fire or enemy observation. Getting out of a disabled Sherman was, by design, easier than getting out of any comparable vehicle on either side. But the engineers who laid out the fighting compartment of the early Sherman made a decision about ammunition stowage that nobody questioned at the time, and that would have consequences no one anticipated. The 75mm main gun rounds, each one a brass casing packed with propellant powder topped by a steel projectile, were stored in racks mounted inside the hull sponsons. The sponsons were the bulging side sections of the hull that extended outward above the tracks on either side of the fighting compartment. Additional rounds, designated as ready ammunition for immediate use, were stored in racks around the turret basket within arm's reach of the loader. This layout was designed for speed. A loader who could grab a round without reaching down to the hull floor could sustain a faster rate of fire. The ammunition was distributed around the tank in a way that balanced the vehicle's weight. Every specification the Armored Force Board had written for ammunition accessibility was met. The problem, the lethal and invisible problem, was that the sponson walls were among the thinnest armor surfaces on the entire tank. The side sponsons presented large, relatively flat target areas to any enemy firing from the flank or the front quarter. A 75mm armor-piercing round from a German Panzer Four or a towed Pak-40 anti-tank gun could punch through the sponson armor at combat distances without meaningful resistance. When it did, the round passed directly through the ammunition stored in the sponson rack. And when a high-velocity hardened steel projectile tears through a stack of propellant charges at several hundred meters per second, the propellant does not need a fuse or a detonator to ignite. The enormous heat and kinetic energy of the penetrating round are more than sufficient. One round catches fire. The burning propellant ignites the adjacent rounds. Within 3 to 5 seconds, the entire fighting compartment is filled with superheated propellant gases and burning powder at temperatures that will soften structural steel. The crew cannot see. They cannot breathe. If their hatches are buttoned up, they become nearly impossible to locate by touch in the blinding smoke. The tank becomes an oven. This was what killed the men at Sidi Bouzid. This was what killed the men at Kasserine. This was what had been killing British crews since El Alamein, and would continue killing Allied crews in Sicily, in Italy, and through the terrible first weeks of the Normandy campaign. And the painful irony was that the explanation everyone believed, that gasoline was the culprit, was directing all the anger and all the demand for solutions at the wrong component of the vehicle. Men were cursing the fuel tanks while the real killer sat in racks 3 feet from their elbows. The proof that gasoline was not the problem was already emerging by 1943, but it required a set of controlled experiments to make the proof impossible to dismiss. After receiving field reports from North Africa and urgent assessments from the British, who had been systematically tracking Sherman fire incidents since the 8th Army's first engagements with the tank, the United States Ordnance Department authorized firing trials through the Armored Force Board, with technical work conducted in association with Aberdeen Proving Ground and its ballistic research laboratory. The experimental design was simple, rigorous, and devastating in what it revealed. The testers took operational Sherman tanks and divided them into 2 groups. The first group was loaded with a full combat load of main gun ammunition, rounds in the sponson racks, rounds in the turret-ready racks, exactly as the tank would be configured going into action. But these tanks were completely drained of fuel and oil. Every drop of gasoline was removed from the fuel tanks. The fuel lines were purged. The engine lubrication system was emptied. These vehicles were as dry of fuel as a tank can possibly be. The second group was the opposite. Full fuel load, gasoline in the tanks, oil in the engine, everything that would be present in a combat-ready vehicle, but with every round of ammunition removed. The racks were empty. Not a single propellant charge was aboard. Then they shot them with the same caliber anti-tank rounds that German gunners were using in North Africa and Europe. They fired into the sponsons. They fired into the turret. They fired into the hull front and the hull sides, and every location where a Sherman was statistically likely to be hit in combat. The results destroyed the gasoline theory in a single dataset. The tanks loaded with ammunition but drained of all fuel caught fire in approximately 90% of fighting compartment and turret penetrations. 90%, with no gasoline anywhere in the vehicle. The propellant in the ammunition racks, exposed to the kinetic energy and heat of the penetrating round, ignited and burned with the same catastrophic violence that crews had experienced in North Africa. The tanks drained of ammunition but carrying full fuel loads rarely caught fire at all. The gasoline, sitting in fuel tanks at the rear of the hull behind a bulkhead separating the engine compartment from the fighting compartment, was almost never the source of the fires that killed crews. It was barely a contributing factor. The trials also revealed something else that changed the approach to the problem. The CO2 fire extinguishers mounted inside the Sherman's fighting compartment, which were the standard firefighting equipment provided to the crew, proved useless against propellant fires. A propellant fire is not like a fuel fire. Gasoline burns because it mixes with oxygen. Remove the oxygen with CO2 and the fire goes out. But gun propellant, whether the single-base nitrocellulose type used in American ammunition or the double-base diglycol formulations used in German rounds, carries its own oxidizer within its chemical structure. It does not need atmospheric oxygen to burn. Smothering it with CO2 does nothing. Only large quantities of water, applied directly to the burning propellant before the fire could spread to adjacent rounds, could suppress the combustion. This finding would become the engineering principle behind the entire wet stowage system. Water was not just one possible solution, it was the only solution. There was a second line of evidence that confirmed this finding from a completely different direction. The Sherman was produced in several variants with different engines. The M4 and M4A1 used Continental radial air-cooled gasoline engines. The M4A2 used a paired General Motors diesel unit, designated the GM6046, which combined twin 671 inline engines on a common crankcase. The M4A3 used a Ford GA, a gasoline V8. The M4A4 used a Chrysler A57 multibank gasoline engine. If gasoline fuel were truly the primary cause of Sherman fires, then the diesel-powered M4A2 should have burned at a drastically lower rate than the gasoline models. The M4A2 burned at the same rate. Diesel or gasoline, the fire behavior after a fighting compartment penetration was statistically identical, because the fire was not coming from the engine bay, it was coming from the ammunition. And there was a third fact that demolished the fuel myth from the German side entirely. Every major German tank of the Second World War was gasoline-powered. The Panzer Four, the backbone of Wehrmacht armoured forces from North Africa to the Volga, ran on a Maybach HL 120 12-cylinder gasoline engine. The Panther, widely considered the best medium tank design to emerge from any country during the war, ran on a Maybach HL2 30V 12 gasoline engine producing approximately 700 horsepower. The Tiger, the most feared armoured vehicle in the German arsenal, used the same family of Maybach gasoline power plant. Not a single one of these tanks ran on diesel. The assumption that German tanks avoided the Sherman's fire problem because they used diesel fuel had never been true. It was an invention, a myth born from the reasonable-sounding logic that gasoline burns easily and diesel does not. Applied to vehicles no one had bothered to check the engine specifications of. The Ordnance Department now had its diagnosis. The ammunition stowage was the killer. The placement of propellant-filled rounds in the most penetration-vulnerable sections of the hull was converting survivable hits into fatal fires. The question was how to fix it. The first approach was brute force. Add armour to the sponsons. The British had tried this in the field, welding and bolting additional steel plates over the sponson areas where the ammunition sat. It helped against smaller caliber weapons and glancing hits, But the primary German anti-tank weapons by 1944, the 75mm PaK-40 and the variants of the 88mm gun, could drive armor-piercing rounds through the base hull armor and the applique plate together without meaningful loss of energy. Adding a thin outer layer was not going to stop the rounds that were doing the killing. The proof came from Normandy. Between June 6 and July 10 of 1944, the British No. 2 Operational Research Section, attached to the 21st Army Group under the direction of Brigadier Basil Schonland, a South African physicist, and his Canadian deputy, the scientist Oman Solant, conducted a detailed forensic examination of Sherman casualties from the first 5 weeks of the campaign. Major Tony Sargent authored the resulting report, designated ORS-2 Report No. 12, formally titled Analysis of 75mm Sherman Tank Casualties Suffered between 6th June and 10th July 1944. Sargent's arithmetic was stark. Of the 45 Shermans in his sample, 89% had been destroyed by armor-piercing shot, 4 had been lost to mines, 1 to unidentified causes. Of the tank-killing hits, 77% had been delivered by 75mm guns and 18% by 88s, and 73% of all armor-piercing penetrations that struck the fighting compartment had caused the tank to brew up. The applique armor, where it had been fitted to the sponsons, had not resisted a single hit in the entire sample. It was as if it were not there. But buried in the data was one finding that illuminated the path forward. During Operation Bluecoat, the British offensive that began on July 30 of 1944, one unit had experienced a brew-up rate so far below the average that it stood out in the dataset like an anomaly. Only 1 in 20 of its tank casualties had resulted in fire, even though at least 12 of those casualties involved full penetrations of the hull by armor-piercing rounds. When the researchers investigated why, the answer was disarmingly simple. That unit had adopted a strict policy of carrying no extra ammunition outside the protected bins. Every other unit in Sargent's sample had been doing what combat crews everywhere did. They stacked extra rounds in every available space inside the hull, on the floor, wedged against equipment, stuffed into corners, anywhere a loader could reach them fast under fire. That loose, unprotected ammunition was the accelerant that turned penetrations into infernos. A round that might have punched through the sponson and buried itself in an empty piece of hull interior instead struck a stack of unprotected propellant charges and set off the catastrophic fire. The crews who fought through the bocage country of Normandy in June and July of 1944 knew this reality in their bones before any operational research section put it into a report. In the hedgerow fighting, where engagements happened at ranges of 50 to 200 meters, and a single German anti-tank gun hidden behind an earthen bank could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being located and silenced. The fire problem was not an abstract statistic. It was the thing that happened to the tank next to you. It was the sound, a deep thudding roar followed by a high-pitched whistle of escaping gas that men who heard it once never forgot. It was the sight of hatches flying open and men climbing out with their uniforms on fire, or hatches that did not open at all. In the bocage, where every field was a potential ambush and the advance was measured in hundreds of yards per day at a cost that rivaled the worst fighting of the First World War, the Sherman's fire vulnerability was the dominant fear of every crew. They feared it more than they feared the German guns themselves, because the gun only had to find them once. The fire was what happened after. Tank commanders in Normandy adopted a range of improvised countermeasures, none of which addressed the real problem. Some units welded additional steel plates cut from destroyed vehicles onto the sponson areas. Some crews draped the hull with sandbags, adding weight that degraded the suspension and the transmission, but that gave the psychological comfort of an extra layer between the crew and the enemy round. Some loaded fewer rounds, accepting a shorter combat endurance in exchange for less propellant inside the vehicle. The unit in Sargent's report that achieved the 1 in 20 brew-up rate during Operation Bluecoat had arrived at the correct solution by instinct, carrying no extra ammunition outside the protected bins. Without knowing the scientific reason why it worked, they had figured out through observation what the Ordnance Department had proven through controlled experiment. Less exposed propellant meant less fire. The question was how to make that principle permanent without reducing the tank's combat load. The answer was not more armor on the outside. The answer was different ammunition stowage on the inside. And by the time Sargent's report was circulating through 21st Army Group headquarters in the late summer of 1944, the Ordnance Department back in the United States had already designed, tested, and begun mass production of the engineering solution. They called it wet stowage. The concept was simple in principle and painstaking in execution. Remove all main gun ammunition from the hull sponsons. Relocate it to the hull floor, the lowest and most protected area of the vehicle, directly beneath the turret basket. Then surround each ammunition storage bin with a jacket filled with a liquid mixture. The initial formula was water combined with ethylene glycol, the same compound used as automobile antifreeze, plus a corrosion inhibitor. The ammunition rounds were not submerged in liquid. Each round sat in a hollow cylinder within the bin. The liquid occupied the space between the inner cylinder wall and the outer jacket. If an enemy round penetrated the hull and struck the ammunition bin, the liquid jacket would rupture first. Water would flood over the propellant charges before they could reach ignition temperature. The fire would be smothered before it had a chance to spread. The first attempt to surround an ammunition rack with water failed during trials, when the initial penetrating round shattered the container by hydraulic action, defeating the purpose entirely. The engineers redesigned the system using concentric cells with liquid between them and an air gap on top, so that a penetration would release the liquid downward over the ammunition rather than blasting the entire container apart. In subsequent trials, of 14 ammunition cells punctured by 37 and 75mm shells, only 2 caught fire. The concept worked. In the 75mm wet configuration, 10 hull floor boxes held 100 rounds, surrounded by approximately 37 gallons of liquid. In the 76mm version fitted to the M4A 376W, 65 of the 71 authorized rounds sat in 13 5-round racks below the turret, plus a 6-round liquid-jacketed ready rack for immediate use in action. The water glycol mixture was later replaced in production by a proprietary compound called Amudamp, because the original glycol formula proved too corrosive for long-term storage. The September 1944 M4A3 technical manual formally defined the innovation, stating that the 76mm gun tank was provided with ammunition racks, which have liquid-filled containers on either side to prevent fire in case the side of the vehicle is pierced, and that this was referred to as wet stowage. The added weight of the liquid jackets and the redesigned racks came to roughly 900 pounds, with additional weight from the increased ammunition capacity in the new layout. It was a significant increase. But the redesign coincided with a new hull layout, featuring larger hatches and a 47-degree glacis plate, and the total ammunition capacity actually increased in some configurations. Every variant that incorporated the system received the W suffix in its designation: M4, A1, 76W, M4A375W, M4A376W. That single letter was the most important character in the entire designation for the men who would crew the vehicle. The first production, Sherman with wet stowage, was the M4A176W, built by the Pressed Steel Car Company, and first accepted in January of 1944. The M4, a 375W, followed in February. The M4, a 376W, in March. The M4, a 276W, the majority of which were shipped to the Soviet Union and Britain under Lend-Lease, entered production in May. By the spring and summer of 1944, wet stowage was standard equipment on every new Sherman coming off American production lines. The one significant exception was the 105mm howitzer variants, the M4-105 and the M4A3-105, which served as close support vehicles and used armoured dry boxes for their shorter, wider howitzer rounds, rather than the liquid-jacketed system. The M4A3E2, known as the Jumbo, a heavily armoured assault variant, of which 254 were built in mid-1944 for the specific purpose of leading columns through defended positions, also incorporated wet stowage alongside its dramatically thicker armour. About 130 M4, a 176W tanks, had arrived in England by April of 1944, stockpiled for the Normandy invasion. The first wet stowage Shermans entered combat with the start of Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. Roughly 52 each were issued to the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions, with additional vehicles distributed to independent tank battalions. The transition from dry to wet was not instantaneous. Dry stowage Shermans continued to serve alongside the new models for months. Crews who had the older tanks were acutely aware of the difference, and field units developed unauthorized modifications to convert dry stowage vehicles to something approximating the wet stowage standard. Maintenance crews welded improvised containers around ammunition bins and filled them with water, imitating the factory design with whatever materials were at hand. These field conversions were never formally approved, and their effectiveness was never tested under controlled conditions. But their existence tells you something important about how badly the men in the older tanks wanted the protection the newer ones had. When a crew will spend hours welding scavenged sheet metal into makeshift water jackets in a freezing motor pool in Belgium, they have made a judgment about their own survival odds that no official report needs to confirm. General Patton's Third Army initially declined the 76mm wet stowage tanks, preferring the older 75 for its superior high-explosive shell in the infantry support role that constituted the majority of a Sherman's actual combat, and accepted the newer gun in significant numbers. Only after the armoured battles around Aracourt in late September of 1944 demonstrated that the 75 could not reliably penetrate the frontal armour of the Panther at combat ranges. But wherever the wet stowage Shermans went into action, the difference in fire behaviour was immediate and stark, and when the numbers were compiled after the war, the difference was not incremental. It was a revolution in crew survivability. A 1945 United States Army study, cited and extensively analysed by the military historian Stephen Zaloga in his work Armoured Thunderbolt, concluded that only 10 to 15% of wet stowage Shermans burned when penetrated by enemy fire. The same study found that 60 to 80% of the older dry stowage Shermans burned under the same conditions. A tanker in a dry stowage Sherman who took a penetrating hit had, at best, a 1 in 5 chance of his tank not catching fire. A tanker in a wet stowage Sherman had approximately a 6 in 7 chance of surviving without fire across the entire First Army. Of 883 tanks examined between 1944 and 1945, including M4s, M5s, M24s, and M26s, 38% had burned overall. The tanks with wet stowage consistently came in at the low end of the distribution. The effect on crew casualties was direct and measurable. Data compiled from United States First Army records spanning June of 1944 through May of 1945, analysed by the retired Army Colonel and military historian Trevor Dupuy in his study Attrition, showed that for each tank destroyed, approximately 1 crewman was killed or wounded on average. But the breakdown between tanks that burned and those that did not was striking. Tanks that caught fire produced roughly 1.28 casualties per loss. Tanks that did not catch fire produced roughly 0.78. Nearly twice as many crewmen were killed or wounded in a burning tank as in one that was merely disabled. The Panzer Faust, the German single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon carried by infantry in enormous numbers from 1944 onward, added a further dimension to the survivability question. Dupuy's data showed that Panzer Faust strikes accounted for only 13% of total tank losses, but inflicted a disproportionate 21% of crew casualties, in part because the shaped charge warhead produced a jet of superheated metal that was extremely effective at igniting ammunition propellant inside the fighting compartment. The Panzer Faust was, in effect, an infantry portable ammunition fire starter, and it was everywhere in the last year of the war. Any modification that reduced the chance of propellant ignition after a hull penetration was therefore protecting crews not only against tank and anti-tank gunfire, but against the most common close-range infantry weapon they faced. The fire was the killer, and wet stowage eliminated the fire in approximately 85 to 90% of penetrations. The difference between life and death in a Sherman had been reduced to a question of interior architecture. Where were the rounds stored? Were they behind liquid jackets? Was the vehicle a W variant or not? That single variable, more than the thickness of the frontal armour, more than the calibre of the main gun, more than the horsepower of the engine, determined whether 5 men walked away from a hit or were carried out in bags. Crews in the 3rd Armoured Division and other units that received the new tanks reported surviving penetrating hits that would have been fatal in the older dry stowage models. A round that entered the hull and struck the relocated underfloor ammunition compartment was absorbed by the reinforced steel walls of the bin and the surrounding liquid jacket, rather than igniting the propellant and filling the FLARs. Fighting compartment with fire. The difference was not theoretical. It was not a figure on a report that a crew would never read. It was felt, personally and immediately, by every crew that took a hit and climbed out alive to fight the next day. Here is the part of this story that should permanently change how anyone thinks about the Sherman. By the final months of the war, the wet stowage Sherman was not merely competitive with German tanks in terms of fire resistance. It was better than every German tank on the Western Front, by a wide margin. The British No. 2 Operational Research Section, the same unit that had documented the Sherman's dismal brew-up rate in Normandy, also performed forensic analysis on destroyed German tanks. The results demolished any claim that German armour was inherently safer for its crews, though the sample sizes for some types were small and should be understood as indicative rather than statistically definitive. The Panzer Four, the most numerous German tank on the Western Front from beginning to end, burned after 4 of 5 penetrating hits in the sample, 80%, requiring an average of only 1.5 penetrations to be knocked out. The Tiger, the most feared German tank in the Allied imagination, also burned in 4 of 5 cases examined, 80%, though it absorbed more punishment before being destroyed, taking an average of 3.25 penetrations. The Panther, examined in a larger sample of 22 vehicles, and therefore the most statistically robust of the three, burned after 63% of penetrating hits, with an average of 3.24 penetrations. The Panther had fire problems that went beyond combat damage. On early production models, the fuel pumps, carburetors, and fuel lines were prone to leakage, which caused raw gasoline to pool in the engine compartment. Driving uphill could slosh this fuel onto hot engine parts and ignite it spontaneously. When Panthers were being assembled for the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, 2 of them were destroyed by engine compartment fires while being unloaded from railroad flat cars. They burned before they had ever reached the front. The Panther's fire vulnerability was, in some respects, more insidious than the Sherman's, because at least the Sherman's problem had a single identifiable cause. The Panther could burn from ammunition cook-off when penetrated, just like any other tank. But it could also burn from fuel leaks that ignited against hot engine components during ordinary driving, a failure mode, the Sherman's design, with its firewall separating the engine bay from the crew compartment, largely prevented. A separate dataset reinforced these findings from the American side. Patton's Third Army conducted a survey in March of 1945, examining 136 destroyed German tanks recovered from the battlefield. The resulting data, compiled in the Operations Research Office Technical Memorandum designated OROT 117 and authored by Alvin Koeks and L. van Loon Nasewald, found that a substantial proportion of German tanks destroyed by direct gunfire had also burned. The percentages were lower than the British ORS figures, which is expected because the Third Army sample included vehicles destroyed by all causes and methods, not only by direct anti-tank fire penetrations, but they confirmed the same underlying conclusion. German tanks burned readily when penetrated. They burned because they carried unprotected propellant in exposed racks throughout the hull and ran on gasoline engines with no fire suppression system designed to protect the ammunition from igniting after a penetration. They burned for the same reasons the early Sherman burned, and unlike the Sherman, not one of them was ever redesigned to burn less. Line the figures up. A dry stowage Sherman burned at 60 to 80%, a Panzer Four at 80%, a Tiger at 80%, a Panther at 63%. The early Sherman was no worse than the tanks it was fighting. In some comparisons, it was marginally better. And the wet stowage Sherman at 10 to 15% was in a category none of them could touch. The tank the world remembers as a death trap was, by the operational research data, the least fire-prone medium tank on the Western Front by the winter of 1944 and 45. An honest investigation must include a caveat that the Tank Museum in Bovington has emphasized. Burn rate statistics from the Second World War are complicated by a tactical reality that affected both sides equally. Anti-tank gunners were trained to keep firing at an enemy tank until they saw it catch fire, because a burning vehicle was the only reliable visual confirmation that it had been permanently put out of action. This means a tank that might not have burned from its first penetrating hit could be struck again and again, specifically to ignite it. The number of burned-out hulls found after an engagement may therefore overstate the actual fire vulnerability of every vehicle type. The caveat applies to every tank in the war. It does not change the relative comparison between vehicles. But it does mean that all burn rate figures, for all tanks, should be treated as indicative of relative performance, rather than as absolute measurements of vulnerability. The medical evidence confirmed the operational research evidence from an independent direction. The British Royal Army Medical Corps conducted a study of tank crew casualties in northwest Europe, authored by Captains H.B. Wright and R.D. Harkness. They examined the incidence and distribution of injuries, including burn injuries, among armoured vehicle crews across multiple vehicle types. Their central finding, stated directly in the published report, was that the incidence of burns was not significantly greater in Shermans than in other types of vehicle. They compared Shermans to British-designed tanks, including the Cromwell and the Churchill, and found no statistically meaningful difference. The medical data matched the operational research data. Once its ammunition stowage was corrected, the Sherman was not unusually dangerous to its crew. The gasoline myth had no support in any dataset that anyone ever collected. So why does nobody know this? Why does the word Sherman still trigger the image of a flaming coffin in the minds of almost everyone who has heard of the tank? The answer is that the myth was simpler than the truth, and in the competition between a simple myth and a complicated truth, the myth almost always wins. The myth had powerful amplifiers across decades. The 1970 film Panther, starring George C. Scott, included a scene in which an officer states that the Sherman's gasoline engine makes it more vulnerable to fire than German diesel-powered tanks. The line was scripted as established fact, delivered to an audience of millions, and never corrected. The idea embedded itself in the popular understanding of the war as firmly as any scene in any film about the conflict. It was reinforced through the 1960s and 70s by tabletop wargames that assigned the Sherman special fire vulnerability rules, based on the gasoline assumption. Wargaming was one of the primary means by which popular understanding of Second World War armoured combat was formed for an entire generation of military history enthusiasts, and the rules baked the myth directly into the simulation. A player rolling dice for a Sherman hit saw the fire modifier on the chart. The modifier was never applied to German vehicles. The asymmetry felt like historical accuracy because it matched what everyone already believed. Television compounded the problem. Documentary series on the History Channel and its competitors ran the same stock footage of burning Shermans over narration that described the tank as a death trap, without ever mentioning ammunition stowage, wet storage, the results of the Aberdeen trials, or the fact that every German tank in the same archival footage ran on gasoline. The burning Sherman became visual shorthand for the cost of the war in Europe, replayed hundreds of times without context until the image itself became the history. And then, in 1998, the myth received what appeared to be its definitive endorsement. A book called Death Traps was published by Belton Y. Cooper, who had served during the war as an ordnance maintenance liaison officer with the 3rd Armoured Division from Normandy through the final advance into Germany. Cooper's job had been to coordinate the recovery and repair of destroyed and damaged tanks after every engagement. He had walked among the wrecks. He had supervised the extraction of hulls with dead crews still inside. His experience was authentic, and his descriptions of what he saw were harrowing and unforgettable. Cooper reported that the 3rd Armoured Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. Over the course of the European campaign, the division had 648 Shermans completely destroyed and another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. He calculated this as a loss rate of 580%. His conclusion was categorical. The Sherman was a death trap. The army had sent men to fight and die in grossly inferior machines when better alternatives, specifically the M26 Pershing heavy tank, could and should have been fielded earlier. The book carried a foreword by Stephen Ambrose. It sold in enormous quantities. It became the reference that journalists, documentary filmmakers, and casual historians cited whenever they needed an authoritative veteran's voice to confirm what the public already believed about the Sherman. The problem with death traps was not that Cooper's experience was invented. It was real. The problem was that his perspective was shaped by the most extreme form of survivorship bias, or more precisely, its inverse. He was a recovery and repair officer. The only tanks he ever personally encountered in his professional capacity were the ones that had been destroyed or severely damaged. He never saw the tanks that survived engagements intact. He never witnessed the firefights where Shermans knocked out Panthers or Tigers, the engagements where the Sherman's superior rate of fire and faster turret traverse decided the outcome. He saw only the worst result of every battle, and generalized from that filtered sample to a conclusion about the entire vehicle and the entire war. The historian Stephen Zaloga, who studied the Sherman more thoroughly than any other living scholar, and who interviewed Cooper multiple times before Cooper's death in 2007, was direct. Zaloga noted that Death Traps was written from memory decades after the events it described, without consultation of archival records, and with the assistance of a co-writer. It reflected, Zaloga wrote, a very limited perspective on American tank operations. The 580% figure was arithmetically correct for the 3rd Armored Division, but it did not mean what most readers believed it meant. It did not mean 5 of every 6 tankers died. It meant the division's tank fleet was destroyed and replaced multiple times over the course of a 10-month campaign through a combination of total write-offs and repaired vehicles returned to service. This was normal for a heavy armored division in sustained combat. German panzer divisions on the Eastern Front experienced equivalent or higher rates of vehicle turnover. Death Traps made no mention of wet stowage. It did not discuss the Ordnance Department's firing trials, proving that ammunition, not fuel, caused Sherman fires. It did not reference the operational research data showing the dramatic reduction in burn rates. It did not acknowledge that every German tank the 3rd Armored Division fought was gasoline-powered. It told a real story, but it told one piece of a much larger story, and the piece it chose to tell was the darkest possible interpretation of the evidence available to one man in one role. The correction came from historians who worked with the full archival record. Zaloga, in Armored Thunderbolt and Armored Champion, presented the operational research data, the ordnance trial results, and the production history of wet stowage. R.P. Hunnicutt, in his exhaustive technical reference, simply titled Sherman, documented every engineering change across every production variant. John Buckley, in British Armour in the Normandy campaign, placed the Sherman in its proper comparative statistical context, using British loss data. Nicholas Moran, a former United States Army tank officer who publishes and lectures under the name The Chieftain, brought the primary documents to a broader public audience. None of them denied the early Sherman's fire problem. All of them demonstrated that the problem was identified, diagnosed, and corrected at a pace and scale unmatched by any other army. No German tank ever received an equivalent modification. The Panzer Four carried its ammunition in unprotected racks from the first day of the war to the last. The Panther did the same. The Tiger did the same. The German ordnance establishment, consumed by the demands of designing progressively heavier, more complex, and more resource-intensive vehicles, never conducted the systematic investigation into post-penetration crew survivability that the Americans and British carried out. The German answer to tanks catching fire was to make the armor thick enough that rounds would not penetrate in the first place. When the armor was penetrated, as it increasingly was throughout 1944 and 45, as Allied guns improved, there was no backup system, no wet stowage, no relocated ammunition, no water jacket, just unprotected propellant in exposed racks, and when it was struck, it burned exactly the same way American propellant burned, because the chemistry of fire does not respect national borders. The Americans chose a different philosophy. They accepted that the armor would be penetrated. They accepted that enemy rounds would enter the fighting compartment. And they asked the question that no other army asked with the same empirical discipline. They asked what happens after the round gets inside. This was not a question the German engineering tradition was inclined to ask, because the German approach to armored warfare was predicated on preventing penetration in the first place. The Tiger's 100 mm of frontal armor and the Panther's 80 mm at a steep slope were answers to the question of how to stop the round. They were excellent answers for as long as they worked. But when a 17-pounder or a 90 mm or a Soviet 122 mm gun put a round through that armor, the question of what happened next had no German answer at all. The Americans, who had always known their Sherman's armor could be penetrated by the standard German 75, had been forced to think about the aftermath from the beginning. The weakness of the armor became, paradoxically, the reason the crew survivability problem was investigated and solved. If the Sherman had been impenetrable, no one would ever have looked at the ammunition racks. The answer was that it hits the ammunition, so they moved the ammunition and wrapped it in water, 37 gallons of liquid and a redesigned set of floor racks. That was all it took. The solution did not require a new tank. It did not require a larger gun or thicker plates or a more powerful engine. It required the institutional honesty to investigate why men were dying and the institutional courage to act on an answer that contradicted what everyone from privates to generals already believed. The men who crewed the early Shermans at Sidi Bou Zid, at Kasserine, at El Alamein, at Gela, at Salerno, and in the first weeks of Normandy, did not have wet stowage. They went to war in tanks carrying a design flaw that turned survivable impacts into fatal fires. Many of them never came home. The men who crewed the late-war Shermans from the autumn of 1944 onward sat above ammunition bins jacketed in water, in vehicles where the odds of surviving a penetrating hit without fire had shifted from roughly 1 in 5 to roughly 6 in 7. They did not know the name of Brigadier Schonland or Major Sergeant, or the engineer at Aberdeen who signed off on the concentric cell design. They knew only that the new tanks seemed to survive hits that would have destroyed the old ones. There is something worth saying about the kind of courage involved in the fix itself, even though it does not involve a battlefield. Somewhere inside the Ordnance Department in 1943, an engineer, or a group of engineers, looked at the data from the firing trials and understood that the standard ammunition layout they had designed and approved and put into production on thousands of vehicles was killing the men who crewed them. That is not a comfortable conclusion for anyone involved in a design process to reach. The institutional incentive in any bureaucracy, military or civilian, is to defend the existing design, to argue that the problem lies elsewhere, to point at the fuel or the armor thickness, or the quality of the crews or the tactics being used. The fact that the Ordnance Department did not do that, the fact that it accepted the evidence, redesigned the interior of the tank, and pushed the new configuration into mass production over a span of months during the largest industrial mobilization in human history, is an accomplishment that has never received anything close to the recognition it deserves. It was not heroism in the way the word is usually used. It was the institutional equivalent of courage, the decision to fix a mistake rather than defend it, made under the pressure of a war in which every month of delay meant more burned crews. Every like on this video keeps stories like this one visible to the people who want the history that was actually recorded, rather than the history that was convenient to believe. The Sherman was not the best tank of the Second World War by any single conventional measure. It was not the most powerful. It was not the most protected. It was not the most feared. But it was the most honestly evaluated tank any army fielded. Its flaws were measured instead of denied. Its failures were tested instead of explained away with assumptions. And when the evidence pointed to an answer that contradicted the universal belief, the answer was implemented, not ignored. The mistake in its ammunition stowage became the discovery that propellant, not fuel, was the source of the catastrophic fires. The discovery became wet stowage, and wet stowage turned the most notorious fire hazard of the war into the least likely medium tank on the Western Front to burn when hit. If this investigation gave you something the myth never told you, subscribe. There are more of these stories in the record, buried in operational research reports and ordnance trial data and medical surveys that no one reads unless someone pulls them into the light. The difference between what everyone believes about the Second World War and what the evidence actually shows is almost always the most important part of the history. And the men who lived and died inside those tanks deserve to have the record set right.